Part 2. Smoke me a kipper. I'll be back for breakfast. Billy Joe Epstein knew he was a coward. And what's more, he knew everyone else knew it too. He gave it off, stank of it somehow, emanated it, like the stench from a weak dead skunk. And on this Saturday night, he sat hunched over his usual bar space, on his usual bar stool over his usual drink, emanating away, and trying to get drunk enough to help him forget he was a coward, which, as usual, was not going to work. Billy Joe, call sign the Jewish Cowboy, was 19 years old, and he knew just about all there was to know about piloting state-of-the-art Space Corps craft. He sailed through the written tests, breezed through the oral exams, excelled at the theory, and in 2 days' time he was going to get thrown out of the Corps. The day after tomorrow, he was going to take and fail his final Space Corps examination flight for the third, and therefore last, time. Because, when it came to the dangerous stuff, the low-level passes over the high-gravity rock deserts of Miranda, Billy Joe Epstein would at the last moment lose his nerve and veer away. Because, as they said behind his back in the locker room, Billy Joe just didn't have the love spuds. He looked into his shot glass and saw his own cowardly reflection staring at him contemptuously in the treacle-coloured liquor, so he drained it and looked up to order another one. She didn't see him, of course. She never seemed to be looking in his direction, even if he was the only one in the bar, which was not uncommon. But that was fine by Billy Joe, because it gave him more chance to be looking at her. Her name was Mamie, not that Billy Joe had ever plucked up the courage to call her by her name. She was, well, better than him. She could have her pick of the jocks who jostled the bar to have the honour of flirting with her, and she wouldn't even give them the time of day. She was special. Her hair, well, you wouldn't say it was brunette, and you couldn't say she was a redhead either. In between, kind of, depending on the light. And her eyes weren't blue, and they weren't green, but you get the idea. And Billy Joe didn't converse with her at all except to order his drinks and keep his manners with please and thank you. Anything else would have been just inconceivable. The thought, even, when it had the temerity to creep into his mind, of actually asking her out on a date, made him feel like someone was twisting his stomach back at both ends with a high-tension torque wrench. While he was waiting for her to notice he wanted serving, Billy Joe felt a tap on his left shoulder. He turned to stare into a gleaming row of medals. "I believe you're in my seat, Sonny." Billy Joe looked around. There was no one else in the barroom. There were 9 empty stools, count them, 9 ranked along the bar. Mamie was looking over now. He felt his ears begin to glow. He glanced at the jock's armband. A commander. "Sure," Billy Joe shrugged. "Sorry." He slipped over to the adjacent seat as manfully as he could. "What stinking luck," the commander grinned. "That one's mine as well." Billy Joe was smiling, not out of bravado, but because his face didn't know what else to do with itself. Was this officer trying to pick a fight? Mamie stepped over and asked Billy Joe, "What'll it be?" "I was here first, old love," the commander smiled pleasantly. "No, you weren't," Mamie returned the smile. The commander's hand shot out rattlesnake fast and grabbed Mamie's wrist. "Let's not have any back-chat, old love," his smile remaining even and calm. Mamie didn't make a sound, but Billy Joe could see she was hurting. He cleared his throat. "I think you've probably had a couple too many drinks, sir." He tried to make it sound as uncontentious as possible. "Maybe you probably should think about possibly not manhandling the lady that way, you reckon?" The officer's smile broadened. He dropped Mamie's wrist. "You feel possibly perhaps you're maybe man enough to stop me, you reckon?" he parodied. Sir? Billy Joe stuttered. "Oh, let's forget about rank here, laddie." The officer slipped off his jacket, its medals clanking musically as he laid it carefully on the bar stool. "Let's forget I'm your superior officer. Let's forget me gold bars, my medals, and my unarmed combat training officer badge. And let's just do it." Billy Joe's face was still wearing the same smile it came in with, and his ears felt like they were about to burst into flames as he watched the officer calmly rolling up his shirt sleeves. There really is no need," It was only a one-syllable word, but Billy Joe started it perpendicularly and ended it horizontally. Eat! He had no idea where the blow had hit him, but his whole face hurt. He looked up. The officer was already rolling his sleeves back down, as if that one blow would be enough to put Billy Joe Epstein down and keep him there. Something about that made Billy Joe mad. Mad enough to make him ignore his instinct to stay down and play dead. Mad enough to make him get to his feet and square up to the man. He felt ridiculous. He didn't know how to fight. He didn't even know how to stand for a fight. He tried hunching up and making small, tight circles with his bunched fists, but he felt like he was in Tom Brown's school days or something. All his life he'd avoided fights, and now here he was picking his first one with a multi-decorated officer who specialised in unarmed combat and could probably kill him 8 different ways with each of his fingers. The officer raised his eyebrows in delight. "Your game, Sonny," he glinted. "Splendiferous stuff. Needed something to get the old circulation going in the fistaroonies." Billy Joe actually saw the second blow. He didn't see it quite quickly enough to avoid it, but it was definitely an improvement, he felt, as it landed on his left ear, hard enough to rattle his brain against his skull like a caged budgerigar in an earthquake. Although he felt it was probably futile even to try, he launched a punch of his own. His vision wasn't exactly clear, but he aimed roughly in the centre of the vibrating image of the officer and was surprised when his knuckles made contact with flesh and bone. The officer drew his hand across his lip and looked oddly at the smear of blood, as if it weren't real, couldn't be happening. Billy Joe hit him again. The officer staggered back. He shook his head. His composure was gone. Anger sprang to his face, and snarling, he leapt at Billy Joe like a rabid wolf. Billy Joe twisted to one side, using the man's momentum against him, and helped him tidily over the bar, where he crashed spectacularly into a stack of bottles promoting Clearhead alcohol-free vodka. Billy Joe stood where he was, making his Tom Brown circles with his fists, until it became obvious that the officer wasn't going to get up again. Then Billy Joe grabbed the commander's jacket. He was astonished at how heavy the clattering medals were, and dumped it over the bar on his opponent's groaning body. "Maybe you should think about leaving now, sir." The officer grunted, staggered to his feet, and crunched over the broken glass and out of the bar without looking back. "You wanted a drink?" Billy Joe turned from the door. Mamie was smiling at him. At him. He shook his head. I don't think so." "On the house?" "No, thanks. I got a big flight exam in a couple of days. I should keep a clear head." "Well," she smiled again, "any time." "That's right kind." He flicked her a salute and turned to go. "Good luck with the test, Billy Joe." He almost froze in the door, but he managed to keep walking. She knew his name. Maybe he'd pluck up the courage to ask her out after all. Maybe he was less of a coward than he thought. He might even have the love spuds to make that low-level flight. He made a deal with himself. If he could do that, he could ask Mamie to the passing-out ball. He caught a glimpse of something glimmering in his right hand. He opened his palm. A St. Christopher medal. He must have grabbed it during the fight. He slipped it into his pocket and forgot about it. And that simple act would save quite a few lives. Admiral Peter Tranter had several names, most of which he knew and approved of, and a few he didn't know and certainly wouldn't have enjoyed. To his peers he was known as Bungo, though no one could really recall why. To the rank and file he was the Admiral, or the Old Man. To his valet, Kevin, he was himself, or, in the dark recesses of the R&R Club, after a bout of intense bad humour and several gimlets, Skunkfoot and Vinegar Draws. His mistress called him Bun Bun to his face. Behind his back, she called him Cheese. Right now, Vinegar Draws was doing his best to destroy the pile on his absurdly luxurious carpet in his ridiculously large office as he paced distractedly around his obscenely huge desk. He wasn't much of an admiral, a one-star job. He commanded the Space Corps Research and Development Program, which, despite its impressive title and its even more impressive budget, was generally regarded as the least demanding post in the Admiralty. Which was why, of course, he'd commandeered such an unfeasibly spacious office, ordered the disproportionately massive desk, and padded around in his legendarily stinky footwear on a carpet so thick that golf balls could, and did, get lost in it. It was his way of bestowing rank upon himself. He'd been a high flyer once, one of the youngest officers ever to achieve the command star. Then, inexplicably, the proud, purring engine of his career had futtered and stopped. He'd received a series of increasingly obvious sideways postings, until this one, the ultimate dead-end gig. There was no sideways from R&D, only up or out. He'd spent many long hours wondering about the why of it. He'd let it affect his work, his alcohol consumption, his personal hygiene, and worst of all, unless you were his valet, he'd let it affect his marriage. He'd almost resigned himself to a dull dramatic career where he never had to make a serious decision, contribute to policy planning, or achieve anything more significant than shagging his mistress from the multitudinous angles offered by his overly humongous and otherwise redundant desk, when Project Wildfire came along. Project Wildfire. Bun-Bun's ticket up and out of here. Project Wildfire was the code name for a prototype craft that, theoretically, could break the big one, could break the speed limit of the universe, the light barrier. And it worked. Sort of. It promised new horizons for the human race, virtually instantaneous travel, the exploration of hitherto unexplorable star systems, and, most magnificent of all, another pip for Admiral Skunkfoot. And now, just days before the inaugural test flight, disaster. The test ship had returned. It had returned approximately 3 days before it set off. Not a terrible result if you chose to look at the upside. They now had 2 Wildfire ships for the price of 1. No small beer, considering the cost of the damn thing. And, as a rather pleasant side effect, they appeared to have devised some form of time travel. On the downside, however, there were clearly some flaws in the design, evidenced by the fact that the returning craft had been damaged beyond repair and its pilot charred dead and almost unidentifiable. Almost. So, this was Tranter's dilemma. This was why he paced with nervous fury around his prop from the Land of the Giants-sized desk. Did he call off the mission and risk his one great shot at personal advancement, or did he send his best and most respected pilot to a certain and unspeakable death? Of course, he'd already made the decision, though he couldn't acknowledge it. What he was really agonizing over was his justification for it. Surely, since the craft had already returned, he was duty-bound to send it off. In fact, did he really have a decision to make? Wasn't it inevitable? Causality and all that? Didn't he owe it to history to embark on this, the next stage of humankind's technological evolution? Didn't he really, really need that extra pip? It was a curious feeling, no question, staring at the blackened remnants of your own grinning skull. Hard not to shudder, though Ace fought off the impulse. He peered into the sightless sockets of his charred doppelganger, as if he expected some glimmer of recognition to flicker back at him from the dull, dead darkness. The technical boys were off checking and rechecking the DNA profile, but Commander Rimmer didn't need any chemical verification. It was his skull, all right, tautened into the familiar, obscene leer of a sudden heat death. There was something out of kilter here, something that shouldn't have been, something important. He called to the shower of sparks spattering from under the scorched nose cone. "Spanners, old love!" The spark spray stopped as the hot rasp of the oxyacetylene died. "Yeah?" "You say you've checked out the dash?" "A dozen times, what's left of it. And it all seems tick-tock." "I don't know. There's something about it that bugs me." The wheels on the trolley of his inspection board squealed against the hangar's rough tarmac as Lister slid out from under the craft and tugged up his welding mask. "Can't put me finger on it. You're not going, you know. Not unless we work out what went wrong." "Don't you start going soft on me, Spanners. You heard what the old man said. This match kicks off at 0600 in the AM, and I'm the centre forward." "I heard what he actually said was, it's up to you." That's the way a gentleman orders another gentleman on a suicide mission, Spanners. It's just good form. Good form? Good form? You're going to get barbecued up there, and you're talking like it's another topping adventure for the famous Five. Ace lowered his shades and hopped the 15 feet down from the cockpit and landed on the tarmac with the easy grace of a prepubescent Russian gymnast. Look, he took out a spotless handkerchief and wiped the sooty grime from his perfectly manicured fingers. Come what may, I'm going to this party, Spanners. It's a chance of a lifetime. Lister forked his hand through the thick wire brush of his regulation crop. I could stop you, you know. It'd take about 5 seconds to do a number on that engine that had put the schedule back months. By God, the acoustics in here are dismal. Otherwise I might have heard a dear friend of mine suggesting it caught spatial events like sabotage. And that would never do now, would it? Listen to me. We all accept we're working on the cutting edge of technology here, and that means there's always going to be a little bit of a risk. But this is different. This isn't a little bit of a risk, Ace. That's you up there, looking like the last spare rib in a Chinese takeaway on a Saturday night. It's you. And from what those tech guys were saying, there's nothing we can do about it. It's already happened. It's inevitable. I don't believe they're right, Spanners. Nothing's inevitable. No matter how bleak things seem, there's always a way through. That belief, that hope, that's the very thing about us that defines our humanity. Now, what do you say we put a lid on the chin-wagging, roll up our sleeves, and comb every inch of this damn crate until we can find out what went wrong and put it right? Lister cracked a warped grin and shrugged with his forehead. Your call, Ace. I'm just a grease monkey. Grease monkey? Ha! Ace mirrored his grin and slapped him heftily on the back. You're the genius who builds the damn things. I'm just the airhead who wiggles the joystick. Now, you managed to dig the black box out, you old tartlet? Lister handed him the recording device he'd torched out of the cone section. Ace jemmied open the seal with an easy twist of the crowbar, while Lister dragged over the portable monitor and plugged in the leads. There was, it seemed to Lister, an unnecessary pause before Ace pressed the play button. Then he realized what the hesitation was about. The poor sod was steeling himself to watch his own death. Look, Commander, he offered. Shouldn't we get this off to tech? They're pretty keen to. All in good time, Spanners. We've got to see this for ourselves. And his elegantly cuticled fingernail flicked play. At first, the screen displayed the computer readout of the standard pre-flight instrument checks. Lister scanned the data. Everything seemed discouragingly normal. Ace craned closer to the screen. Display's a bit dim, isn't it, old sausage? It might seem a bit less dim, Lister said, if you took off your smegging shades. Ace smiled apologetically. Like the preacher says, all is vanity. And he raised his sunglasses. Lister met his gaze. Commander Rimmer was sporting a black eye, a real Shiner-Rooney. Ace's expression said, don't ask, so Lister didn't. So it was true. He'd heard it, but he hadn't believed it. Commander Ace Rimmer had been given a tonking by Billy Joe Epstein. How was that possible? Ace tossed his head gently so the soft wave of his fringe hung over the offending feature, and they both turned their attention back to the screen. It was a short recording. The entire trip, launched ablaze, had taken less than 15 minutes, and when it was over, they could still find no clue as to what had happened, or, unthinkably, what was destined to happen, and how they might go about preventing it. There was a clue, though. In fact, there were 3 clues, staring out at them from the screen in every single frame of the recording. The contents of Lister's stomach lolloped queasily as he sipped at his 7th or 8th mug of disgusting coffee. He glanced at his watch without taking in the readout. It was night, it was dark. Over the quadrangle there was a warm woman asleep in his bed, with a dent in the mattress beside her, which he should have been occupying, and that was all he needed to know about the time. He tried to focus once again on the looped recording he'd made of the black box tape. The original was now being pored over by the overpaid research staff in their air-conditioned lab, with a plentiful supply of hot snacks and good fresh coffee to hand, while Lister shivered in the fume-laden yawn of Hangar 101, wondering whether to spend the last of his loose change on the oxymoronically named Tasty Noodle pot from the dispensing machine, or save it for a final mug of the foul coffee. It had been a while since he'd pulled a round-the-clock shift, but the symptoms of exhaustion were as familiar as an old friend. Right now, he was experiencing the big gloom phase, which always hit just before the dawn, when he began to feel resentful of regular people sleeping their sane sleep in their sensible beds with their normal daylight-hour jobs. Parts of his body started to become forgetful about how to perform the most basic operations. His mouth would neglect its swallowing duties, and he suddenly realized drool had caked on his chin. His buttocks wouldn't shift frequently enough in the chair, and sharp pains would shoot up his back. He comforted himself with the thought that the next phase couldn't be too far away, and that was the good part. He would suddenly be aware that daylight had sneaked up on him, and he'd get an adrenaline rush, thinking of being the first customer at the breakfast canteen, of the mounds of sizzling fresh bacon he'd deservedly consume, of watching the poor suckers who'd slept the night away dragging their way into a day of drudgery, while he wound his way home to the sweet caress of a sleep well-earned, with sunbeams slanting onto the bed through the slits in his curtains. He began to feel special, almost more than human, having gone on where lesser men would have surrendered. And best of all, he would feel incredibly horny. He jumped at the sudden loudness of the hangar door sliding metallically back, thus adding stale coffee to the unnameable melange of stains and odours on his overall crotch. He cursed mentally. For the past 5 years he'd been fighting a running battle against his own natural sloppiness, and was still losing badly. The fluorescents buzzed and clicked on, filling the hangar with shocking white light. "Good God, Spanners! You still here, old fruitcake?" Lister tried to speak, but the coffee and tiredness had furred his throat, and what came out of his mouth sounded like the unintelligible ranting of a chronic drunk raging across the street at invisible demons. He coughed and tried again. "What time is it?" 4 a.m. Time for you to catch some Zeds, old chumburger. The Whitecoats come up with anything? Zipperola, I'm afraid. They've run everything through the simulator upside down and back to front. Nada. They're tearing their hair out. You get anywhere? Lister rolled his head back along his shoulders, cracking his neck satisfyingly. There's got to be something here. It's just a matter of time. Face it, Spanners. If you haven't found it, it's not there. You get some shut-eye. I'm going to need you around for the pre-flight check, so you're only going to fit in about 90 weeks anyway. Lister thought about protesting, but couldn't work up the energy. He sighed big time and pushed his casted chair away from the screen. "Half an hour," he said, as if it were a threat. "On the inspection trolley. You'd better wake me." "Good man." Heath leaned over and stopped the disc. In the sudden silence that whistled emptily through Lister's fatigue-sensitized ears, a thought struck him. Obvious. It was obvious. "Hang on," he yelled, and hopped back to the video console. He hit search play and then pause. There this is." Ace peered at the flickering still frame. Suddenly, his face ignited with delight and relief. "By God, Spanners, you've only gone and cracked it." There, it was staring at us all the time. We couldn't see for looking." Lister's enthusiasm might have been more welcome to Admiral Tranter if, A, it had been a slightly more civilized hour than 5 in the morning, B, the man's breath had smelled slightly less like hyena's flatulence, and C, in his ebullience, he'd remembered it was considered impolite in superior circles to spray the listener with stale coffee-coloured spittle when speaking. What precisely had been staring at them all the time? The Admiral leaned closer to the screen and peered at the frozen image of Commander Rimmer in the cockpit. "Sorry, I just can't—" Lister leaned forward and tapped the screen rapidly with the knuckle of his forefinger. "There!" He turned his wide-eyed grin towards the Admiral, barely millimetres from his face. "There!" Tranter tried to maintain his querulous smile as he was treated to a hot wave of Lister's pungent expiration. "All right, chaps, let's not make this a guessing game." "It's there! There!" Lister jumped up and down, grinning, his eyebrows crescented at the very peak of their elevation. Tranter seriously considered taking his pistol out of his drawer and splattering what passed for this man's brains over his wall. He could have it framed and tell everyone it was a Jackson Pollock.
The date! Check out the date time readout.
The date?
3103.
He nodded enthusiastically, as if he were training a particularly stupid dog to sit up and beg.
31st of March, he translated. 3 days ago.
Tranter maintained his cool by reflecting that it would probably be an exceptionally small Jackson Pollock. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that precisely when we recovered the craft?
Yes.
Ace recognized the dangerous glint in Tranter's eye and cut in. You see, Admiral, if this were our Wildfire 1, if we'd launched it today, it had broken the time barrier and showed up 3 days ago, the flight recorder would have logged today's date. Tranter glanced over at Roddenberry, the white-coated technical coordinator, who was trying his best not to look shamefaced. The date? These boss were talking about cracking time travel and they hadn't checked the bloody date? Don't understand. If this isn't our ship, then whose the hell ship is it? Roddenberry cleared his throat. Well, in a way, we're not absolutely 110% certain, Admiral. But I saw the test results. You assured me, did you not, that the corpse in that craft was unquestionably that of Commander Rimmer? Tranter's eyes flitted guiltily at Ace, then carried on glaring at Roddenberry. Oh, yes, sir, I believe you said you were certain. 115% certain, as I recall. Indeed, that is also my recollection of, our conversation, Admiral. But there may be some... So would you like to explain to me how it is possible for him to be both dead and alive at the same time? Well, I believe Commander Rimmer's theory is about the best spin we can put on it. Commander Rimmer's theory? Well, I wouldn't take credit for its being my theory, Admiral. I just helped thrash it out with Spanners here and a couple of the tech boys. You see, I think our blind spot's been this breaking the time barrier business. You can understand everyone jumping to that conclusion, wanting it to be true. Damn it, I wanted it to be true myself. So it's... Have I got this straight? We haven't broken the time barrier, then? Not exactly, Admiral. Tranter slumped into his oversized chair. He actually felt his eyes begin to sting with disappointment. He'd already rather rashly ordered a dozen new, hideously expensive gold stars for his uniforms, twice as many as necessary, just in case the Admiralty saw fit to leapfrog him up to a triple pipper. Ace lit one of his rare cheroots, his only vice unless you counted an extremely active, multi-partnered sex life as a vice, which Ace didn't. I believe we've cracked the reality barrier. The reality barrier? Tranter leaned forward. He had no idea what the reality barrier might be, but it sounded good. It sounded wonderfully promotional. Let's look at the facts. 1. This pilot, let's call him the Beta Rimmer. He took off on the test flight 3 days earlier than ours was scheduled. 2. The Beta Rimmer hasn't got one of these beauties. Ace raised his shades, exposing his black eye. Where did you get that, Commander? Tranter had heard a rumour, but it couldn't be true. Altercation with a door jam, Admiral. Ace lowered his sunglasses. Conclusion, the Beta Rimmer is not me. He's almost me, just not quite. Now, from here on in, it's speculation and prediction, but I think it's pretty solid. We believe the Beta Rimmer belongs to another reality, another dimension, if you like, coexisting with our own, but neither affecting the other, slightly out of phase. When the Beta ship hit the light barrier, it jumped out of its own dimension and into ours. So, you're saying that there are two realities, two universes running parallel with each other, with only minor differences in between, and the Wildfire drive can jump between them? Why only two, Admiral? Why just an alpha and a beta reality? Why not a delta and a gamma reality? Ace craned over Tranter's huge desk. Why not an infinite number of realities, coexisting simultaneously with each other? Tranter found himself wondering if this might be an appropriate juncture to avail himself of the secret supply he kept hidden in the water tank of his office bathroom. But the sun couldn't honestly be said to be over the yardarm quite yet. It was 5 a.m. The sun wasn't even over the bloody horizon. But why? Where would these realities come from, and what would they be doing there? Ace tugged on his cheroot. Here's the theory. Almost every day we all make decisions that affect the course of our lives. Should we take the job or hang in for something better? Should we run across the road or wait for the lights to change? Should we have the ham or the chicken? Now, what if every time we made a choice that affected the course of our life, in some other reality, the alternative were played out? Say, in the Alpha universe, we wait for the lights and cross safely, but in the Omega universe, we run across the road and get hit by a truck. Here we choose the ham and everything's okay. There we go for the chicken and contract salmonella. Tranter reflected. In another reality, then, some alternative Admiral Tranter at this point in the conversation would have made his excuses and headed for the bathroom. He turned the thought over in his mind before deciding he might as well make it this reality then. "Excuse me for a second, gentlemen." He rose and padded pensively through the thick carpet to his private lavatory and locked the door. He fished out the navy room and sucked down its dark red warmth. What did all this mean? Obviously, it was intriguing, but he couldn't immediately envisage any practical application of the breakthrough. He couldn't imagine what use the military might make of it. In short, he couldn't be certain it would lead to career enhancement, gold star-wise. He screwed the cap back on the bottle with practised speed, liberally sprinkled his mouth with peppermint spray, and doused his chin with yet more aftershave, then replaced the water tank cover, flushed the toilet unnecessarily, and padded back into his office. "It's certainly a fascinating concept, Commander. Thing is, I can't quite see where it takes us." Ace looked up from the computer he was poring over with Roddenberry. "The point is, something went wrong with the beta ship. We think we now know what that something was. They jumped too close. Our mathematical models predict a kind of super-friction between dimensions, something to do with incompatible tachyon densities. Don't quite follow it myself," Ace lied, having been personally responsible for discovering the super-friction equation. "But basically, it boils down to this. The closer the reality, the tougher the friction. That's what scorched the crate. It came in too close to home. As best we can tell, if we increase the drive burn by a factor of 5 or 6, the super-friction will be reduced to tolerable levels." Tranter's cheeks glowed red with alcohol burn as he tried to follow Ace's logic. That sly snifter had done him no good at all. He wished he'd been in the reality where Admiral Tranter had sagely resisted the temptation to drink before breakfast. "All well and good, Commander, but where does it get us, exactly? Anyone can see the applications of a drive that can travel through time. But what possible benefit can we deduce from a drive that can transverse realities? I mean, could we, for instance, aim for a dimension, say, where time travel has been perfected and bring the technology back?" Ace shook his head. "Afraid not, Admiral. As far as we can tell, dimension travel's something of a one-way street. Frankly, even if we thought we could find a way back, it would be impossible to establish for absolute certain whether or not the reality we returned to was the one we had left." Tranter poured himself a glass of water from his unusually large carafe. "So, the upshot is, Commander, you're expecting me to give a green light to this trip, knowing that the best we can hope to achieve from it," he sipped, "is flushing $30 billion pounds of hardware and the best pilot we've ever had straight down the Kazi." No doubt about it, he'd have to choke down his pride and send those bloody stars back as soon as they arrived. In fact, he might do well to check up on the second-hand value of the stars he was already wearing. Admiral, we're about 97% certain Wildfire 1 could fire off a tachyon message complete with digitalized video footage of the new universe, so long as he got it off inside, say, 15 seconds of arrival, while his trail back was still warm, as it were." "Oh, much better. A blurry shot of some stars that are probably identical to the ones we've already got, and a soundbite for the news at noon. That's a fabulous return for an outlay of $30 billion. That'll probably snag me the cover of Investor's Chronicle. I mean, at least the original moonshots from Earth gave the world Teflon." "Oh, come on, Bongo," Ace cooed. "You wouldn't stop a girl going to a big dance like this, would you? Who knows where the technology could lead? We've got to try it now we know it's there." Lister spoke up. He was beginning to hit the feel-good phase of fatigue. He was even starting to feel horny.
"Admiral, if the commander can shoot off that message, it means we'll know for sure the dimensions theory is sound. And if it's true, it's mind-blowing. It means that every possibility gets played out. Everyone gets a fair share of decent shots and bad breaks. It means, in the end, that there really is justice in the universe. Life means something.
Admiral Tranter found himself wishing he was in another reality again. One of the realities where Lister hadn't chosen that moment to get an erection, or at least hadn't been too tired to notice it and cover the fact up. But no, he was stuck here in this reality where some solitary trooper in Tranter's head was playing the last post for his career, while he stared across his desk, eye to eye, with Lister's love pole, which was making an Action Man-sized tent out of the crotch of his unspeakable overalls. He directed his gaze at Ace. "I'm sorry, Commander. I'm going to have to refer this one upstairs."
"You what?"
A globule of stale coffee spittle landed on Tranter's desk.
"You're going to pass the buck? The one chance you've had in God knows how many years to do something halfway worthwhile and you're turning it down."
Tranter, stunned, looked up into Lister's psychopathically wide eyes. He was convinced the oily little sod was going to clamber onto his desk on all fours and rip out his throat with bare teeth. "Easy now, laddie," Ace's calm voice cut through the tension. "The Admiral's right." But Lister was beyond restraint.
"Wake up and smell your early morning dump, vinegar drawers. They'll turn it down. They always do, because it's easier to say no. Those arsewipes wouldn't know a breakthrough if it raped the cattle and stole their wives. If that ship doesn't fly today, it'll never fly. They'll cobweb it in some hangar till nobody can remember what it was built for in the first place. Now is the time. Now or never."
Tranter's finger was hovering below the red security button concealed on the underside of his desk. He would have pressed it, but he was intrigued. Had this piece of scum really called him vinegar drawers? What did he mean by vinegar drawers? "Finished, boy?" Lister wasn't finished. Not quite.
"Look at you. You sit there behind your enormous desk in your huge office because you think it makes you look big. Well, it doesn't. You know what? It makes you look small. Tiny man, tiny mind. Who knows what he'll find out there? Smeg, he might even chance on some far-flung reality where the base commander isn't a petty little small-minded lush."
That did it. Tranter hit the button, and the two security guards were in the room and frog-marching Lister to the brig before he even had the chance to wish he'd had his mouth sewn up at birth. It wasn't, strictly speaking, sunlight. This far out in the solar system, the sun wasn't a big player, energy source-wise. What passed for sunlight on the ice world of Europa was the bright orange glow of the planet Jupiter, magnified through the reinforced plexiglass dome that held the Jovian satellite's artificial atmosphere. Still, Ace Rimmer had spent most of his life under horizons dominated by the majestic disk of the king of the planets, and for him this was the skyline of home. In all probability, he would never see it again. And he was afraid. He wasn't afraid of the mechanics of the trip. He was fairly certain his alterations to the drive would make the jag through the reality barrier safely enough. He was afraid of what he might find. True, he had more idea than most about his destination. He knew, for example, that wherever he wound up, it would be somewhere along his own destiny line. He would encounter another version of himself, another Rimmer, whose history would have diverged from his own at some point in their shared lives. Amplifying the magnitude of the wildfire leap by a factor of 5 would probably mean their paths had divided a significant while ago, possibly several years. And he was afraid of meeting himself. He was afraid this other Rimmer would be better than him somehow, a Rimmer who had made better choices, who hadn't taken the frivolous option of following his lust for excitement, a Rimmer who had contributed more to mankind, a Rimmer who would make him feel inadequate. He was saved from his maudlin mental meanderings by a woman's voice. "Commander! Commander Rimmer!" He looked up. Mamie Ferson was scuttering over the parade ground from the direction of the club, in heels not built for running. She reached him, breathless, then arched, hands on knees, to reoxygenate. "Commander," she panted. "Thank God, I heard you'd gone." She straightened, her face even more beautiful for the red glow of exertion. "Mamie, are you all right?"
All right? All right? I'm perfect."
"Well, I'll be the judge of that, old love." He smiled and brushed a dark wisp of hair from her right eye. It flopped back immediately. "No, you're right, you are perfect." Mamie punched him playfully in the chest.
Didn't you hear? Billy Joe passed. He passed grade 1. He's got his gold wings.
Best news I've heard all year.
And it's all thanks to you, you brilliant old clever custard.
Me? I think it probably had rather more to do with young Billy's flying abilities, wouldn't you say?
You know what I mean. He'd never have had the confidence if...
Well, punch me in the hooter if I miss my mark, young lady. But I thought we'd agreed never to mention that little business, didn't we?
Well, I wouldn't. Not to anyone else. Not even to Billy Joe.
Especially not to Billy Joe. Not even when the pair of you are old and grey and sitting by some glowing fire surrounded by hordes of yowling grandchildren, all right? Mamie's cheeks flushed even redder.
You're getting a bit ahead of yourself, aren't you, Commander? He hasn't even asked me for a date.
Oh, but he will. He'll be looking for a special someone to take to his passing out ball, and unless I've seriously lost my touch, that someone will be young Mamie Fersen. Mamie dropped her head.
You think?
Either that, or I'll really have to box his ears and knock some sense into him. She thumped him playfully again. Ace smiled. Why was a punch considered an acceptable witty riposte when administered by a young woman? If a man answered a playful remark in that way, Ace would have ranked him in terms of intellectual capacity and social skills alongside a TV weather presenter. When a woman did it, it just made his heart melt. She looked up, and something in his smile pained her. She looked away again. Commander, I've heard people talking around the camp. I mean, they don't understand what you were really doing for Billy Joe, and they're saying things. It makes it hard to keep it to myself. Now, people will talk, Amy. That's the way of the world. Sticks and stones, etc., eh? And that black eye, and Billy Joe will never even know he should be thanking you. Listen to me, young lady. The way things turned out, this little Shinarooney was the best thing that could have happened to me. You'll never know how, but this little beauty saved my bacon. It's me who should be thanking Billy Joe. Ace glanced at his watch. Time to spring spanners. Look, really must fly now, Mamie. Best of luck with the date. He kissed her tenderly on the cheek and strode off over the parade ground. Mamie shielded her eyes against the Jupiter glare, watching his sure-footed silhouette disappear into the early morning heat haze. When he'd gone, she sighed a smile and said, to no one in particular, "What a guy." Somewhere, way off, there was an old-fashioned fire engine charging along to intercept his dream, hissing, "Lister, Lister," in between its primitive clanging. He slowly floated awake to find his left side completely paralyzed from the unyielding pressure his coma-tired body had inflicted on itself. Where was this place? The walls were grey and unmarked. A dull strip light farted its bleak radiance into the tiny room from overhead. He'd been in this kind of place before, yes. If he was right, he would turn his head and see bars. He turned his head. Next best thing, wire mesh. He was in some kind of cell. He swung his good leg over the side of the bench, dragging its unresponsive partner along with it. Hanging onto the bench with his right hand for balance, he swung his left shoulder several times until his limp hand flopped up onto his lap, and he could check his watch. 6:36. This was good. He knew where he was. He knew the time. Now, if only he could remember what the Smeggy was doing here, all would be right with the world. Again, he heard the hissed, "Lister, Lister," and the dull clanging of an enamel cup against metal mesh. The voice sounded familiar. "Can you hear me, old building alone drinking buddy?" Oh, my God, it couldn't be. "Peterson," he called timidly. "That's right. I knew I recognized that smegging snore." What was going on? He hadn't seen Peterson in 2 years, not since he and Chrissy had been reassigned from Red Dwarf to the Europa test base. What was the mad Dane doing in the next cell? Had it all been a cruel dream? "Peterson, where are we?" Peterson's laugh rattled the mesh in Lister's cell. "Ha! That's my old drinking buddy, all right. We're in some kind of prison, is my guess." "But we're on Europa, right?" "Could be. Yes, I think so. Blue moonish-type planetoid, close to that big bastard with the red spot? Yeah, that's Europa." "Bingo!" Peterson said, and laughed again. Lister started massaging some life back into his dead leg. "Question is, Olaf, what are you doing here?"
It's a little hazy, but about 24 hours for drunken disorderly, I would reckon.
Yeah, I mean, why aren't you on Triton?
Triton? Oh yeah, that house I bought. No good. Couldn't take it. Beautiful house, but no oxygen, no gravity, and worse than that, no alcohol. Those sly bastards won't even let you smuggle it in honestly. I mean, hey, I don't mind floating around a 25-bedroom mansion in a spacesuit 24 hours a day with no neighbors for 1,000,000 miles or so, but doing it sober was such a drag. So I signed back up on the Dwarf. Incidentally, the house is on the market if you're interested.
Red Dwarfs here, in Space Dock? Could that be possible? That big ogre of a rust bucket had been all the way to the edge of the solar system and back here, with 18 months of mining in between. Could it really have been 2.5 years since he left?
She's here all right, baby. We put into orbit last night. I came down on the first shuttle to see my old buddy, but no one could find you. So I went to the bar and stayed for a beer or 37 waiting for you to show. Next thing I know, you're snoring in the next cell like a wounded wild hog with asthma.
Is Lou Pemberton still on board?
Pemberton? Sure. Said I should say hello from him. He's got 2 promotions since you saw him last. Officer class now.
Lewis Pemberton, Lister smiled. He wouldn't have lasted 2 months on Red Dwarf without Lou as his roommate. He was the guy who brought Lister and Kachensky back together after their first bust-up, giving them this big speech about passion and how it can blow up and get destructive, and you have to guide the relationship gently into something more stable. It was Pemberton who encouraged him to sign up for night classes in mechanics, even helped him with his homework. No question, you'd be looking at a different Dave Lister right now if it hadn't been for Pemberton.
I was asking around about you, Davy boy. They say you're a responsible fellow now, a father, with kids even.
Twins, Jim and Bexley, just coming up 2 years old. Lister reached into his overall pocket. I've got a picture, but I don't think I can get it through the mesh.
That's okay, I'll just imagine I've seen it.
Peterson paused, then in a dull, flat monotone said,
Well, they are beautiful just like their old man, but I think they have their mother's eyes. Good enough?
Lister grinned. That'll do, yeah. He popped the photo back in his pocket.
Question is, what's a reliable, upstanding family man like you doing in the trunk tank?
Reality slapped the smile from Lister's face. I'm in for gross insubordination.
Oh, good. Nice to know you cleaned your act up, being a daddy and all. Hope you didn't chew out someone too important.
Nah, Lister grimaced. Only the Admiral. Peterson whistled through his jagged teeth.
Smig, you could be in here for weeks.
Lister rested the back of his head against the cold brick. Months, even.
But wait a minute. I've only got a 4-day pass.
There was horror in Peterson's voice.
We won't be able to get drunk together.
Keys jangled, and Lister looked up to see the SP on the guard's white helmet bent towards the cell's keypad. The door sprang back, and the guard said, You're out of here, friend. Lister straightened and stretched. I'm free. Ace stepped into the doorframe.
Special clearance, Operation Wildfire.
Lister stepped out into the corridor.
Really? You cleared it with the old man?
Ace grinned.
Let's just say he won't object.
Peterson's face was pressed up against his mesh.
What about me?
He smiled in a way that, on another face, might have come out as coquettish. On Peterson, it looked like a mad, threatening leer. He batted his eyelids.
I'm thoroughly sober now, good guardian of the law.
The SP turned to face him. Do you have any recollection of the events of last night, friend? Lister folded his arms and settled back to listen. He was going to enjoy this. Not surprisingly, this was a scenario in which Peterson frequently found himself, and, over the years, he polished his responses to such a degree he might be considered a true artist in the field of bullshit. Peterson put on his best contrite and humble look and began.
I can't quite remember every single episode of my regrettable misadventures with absolute precision, officer. But I'm sure I behaved in many beastly ways, for all of which I most deeply and humbly apologize. Rest assured, most respected lawman, my contrition is complete. I intend to forswear the demon alcohol which brought me to this sorry pass and live forevermore in this blessed state of sobriety.
So you don't remember, say, racing across the parade ground, singing the theme from the Dam Busters, and bombing the guard post with luminous urine-filled condoms?
Peterson's eyes flitted up and left. Can't say it strikes a chord, no. But if I did commit such an heinous deed, it would be most out of character, as I am at all times a thoroughly wholesome, gentle, and amiable chap, much given to poetical musings and charitable acts, as my good friend of many years with extremely high security clearance here will readily attest. He nodded encouragingly at Lister. Does your memory stretch to the part where you stole a motorcycle from the compound and scrawled obscenities over the ornamental garden in tire marks? Did I really do that? Then I must repair forthwith to the nearest pharmaceutic establishment and have them replace my medication, which, despite its salutary effects on my incurable heart condition, quite clearly produces disastrous and unacceptable side effects. And I'll bet you don't recollect stapling my colleague's penis to his groin. Peterson licked his lips. I don't suppose you'd consider an extremely substantial bribe. I can give you the deeds to an exceptionally desirable residence on one of the solar system's most up-and-coming moons. Do you have the remotest conception of the penalty for affixing a shore patrolman's genitalia to his thigh? You are history, friend. We're going to shut you in and melt the lock. Peterson turned his pleading eyes to Lister. Davy, can you help me here? Lister turned to Ace. The commander rolled his eyes and stepped forward. He's with us, Sergeant. Commander, you want me to release him? He's essential to the project. Essential to the project? What do you do, use his breath for fuel? You can release him under my cognizance, Bob. I'll see he stays out of trouble. Reluctantly, the guard tapped the release code into Peterson's door lock. If you say so, Commander. He paused before the last digit and looked up at Peterson, who was struggling to keep the delight off his face. If I were you, friend, I'd steer clear of Reinhardt. Reinhardt? Sergeant Arden Reinhardt? The guy whose wanger you whacked with the staple gun? He had a very hot date tonight, only his little German soldier's going to be wrapped up like King Tutankhamun for the next 2 months, and he isn't in the best of humor. Last I heard he was making plans to return the favor, only with hot steel rivets. Ouch. The door swung open, and Peterson stepped free. Thanks for the warning, officer. He turned to Lister and Ace, rubbing his hands. Now then, gentlefolk and essential personnel, let's get on with Project Wildflower. Wildfire. Whatever. So, it's on then. Lister followed as Ace led the group across the quadrangle towards the briefing room. Peterson brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, searching for mad, limping Germans with high-pitched voices brandishing rivet guns. It's on all right, Spanners. Kick off at 0800. The old man seemed pretty empty last I saw him, so what changed his mind? You did, Spanners. Me? Another one I owe you, you old lemon tartlet. Lister shook his head. No matter how many favours Ace did you, he always made it seem like he was in your debt. What happened? He resigned. He resigned? Best thing for him, old love. He was on the brink. Maybe he'll start to enjoy life a bit now. Left me in charge of Project Wildfire. So, what's the plan? Ace stopped. I'm just off to give the tech boys a final briefing. I want you to give the crate a quick once-over. I wouldn't feel right if it went up without your blessing. Then I want you to hot-tail over to Mission Control. If anything does go wrong, I'd rather you were up there giving me feedback. No prob. Appreciate it. Then, Ace fished in his pocket, I want you to take a couple of weeks off with the fam. I've already organised the paperwork for you and Chrissy to get leave. Here. He tossed Lister a set of keys. What are these? I've got a quaint little holiday cottage on Io. Nothing fancy, but a beautiful view. Own private beach. It's yours if you want it. For the whole fortnight? Permanently. Wait a minute. You're giving me your holiday home? Well, I'm not going to need it any more, old sausage, now am I? What about me? Peterson leaned his chin over Lister's shoulder and grinned winsomely. Can I do you any small personal favours in return for extravagant gifts of real estate and such like? What you can do for me, matey, is stay out of trouble. My plan, absolutely. I am a reformed character. You can bet your last penny cent on that, Commander. Ace nodded, flipped an unofficial desultory salute, and headed off to the briefing room. Lister looked at the keys, then at Rimmer's rapidly shrinking figure. He shook his head.
What a guy, he said.
A prince, Peterson agreed. There's just one thing bothering me.
What's that?
Where in the hell am I going to get a drink at this time in the morning?
A chunk of grey ash tumbled from the tip of the double Churchill cigar and plopped into the bathwater, where it sizzled happily a moment, then sank beneath the sweet-scented foam. Admiral Stinkfoot-no-more Tranter sighed a contented plume of brown smoke into the steam-filled air and slipped deeper into the bath, so that the bubbles formed an Abe Lincoln beard under his chin. He hooked his big toe, which by now resembled a large pink walnut, under the plug chain, and tugged. Slowly the water gurgled away, leaving him swathed in a suit of foam. He climbed out of the tub and padded towards the shower cubicle. He hit the cold tap and thrust himself, cigar and all, into the icy curtain of water, where he stayed until his testicles had retracted almost completely into his body. Clad only in goosebumps, he dripped his way out of the bathroom into his oversized office and squeaked back into his huge leather recliner. He was a free man. His resignation had already been emailed to Central Command. By the time it filtered through the thick layers of bureaucratic incompetence to the correct computer screen, Commander Rimmer and the Wildfire ship would be long gone. Tranter lifted his foot onto the desk and tapped the monitor link button with his wrinkled toe. The screen flicked on and Ace's helmeted face appeared. The takeoff dialogue blotted tinnily out of the speakers.
Wildfire, we are all go at this end. 0 minus 30 from my mark. And mark.
Treasury mission engaged.
Tranter smiled. In less than half a minute, $30 billion of Space Corps-spawned Dulics would be winging their way out of this reality for dimensions unknown, and none of the promotion-pinching turd-burgers at Central Command could do a blind thing about it. Of course, their initial reaction would be to take it out on Tranter. They might threaten to withhold his pension or have him declared insane, or even drag him before a court spatial. But in the end, they'd back down. They wouldn't want it known to the government agencies who allocated budgets that the money had been flushed away pointlessly. They'd build up the importance of the breakthrough. Tranter might even come out of it a hero. Not that he cared much. Within 24 hours he'd be en route to his condominium on Venus, where he would at last be able to indulge his enthusiasm for 1/3 gravity golf, preferably with his wife, who at least still shared that passion with him. He thought they might still make something of their marriage, with a little work from both sides. They might even make it all the way to happiness. The huge blast of Wildfire's takeoff rockets drew his attention back to the screen. Ace's image jutted out of Europa's meagre grasp and howled towards Jupiter. The mission controller's voice tizzed,
Wildfire, you are go-go.
And the crowd in the control tower cheered mightily. Tranter smiled and tugged open a pointlessly large drawer. He fished out his Hawaiian shirt and +4s and began to dress in the only clothes that ever allowed him to feel comfortable, the clothes of his new life. Of course, there was a large element of the unknown in that new life. Even an admiral's pension wouldn't provide for an opulent lifestyle, and there was no guarantee his wife would decide to go with him to Venus. She might even make good her threats to divorce him, which would leave him fairly close to destitute. Still, whatever his future held, Tranter embraced it. As it happened, his small fears were groundless. His wife would not divorce him. They would find happiness together. As Tranter tugged on his loafers, he heard Commander Rimmer announce,
Engaging Wildfire Drive,
and glanced up at the monitor as the screen whited out. This was it, the moment of truth. After an achingly stretched instant, visuals returned again. Tranter craned closer to the monitor. Ace was alive. The readouts already stood within safe margins. He'd done it. The commander had leapt to a new dimension. Rimmer's voice was carried along by the promised tachyon transmission, alongside bursts of digitized Navicomp information. For a man who'd pioneered a new frontier for humankind, his voice was astonishingly calm and matter-of-fact.
Bingo, MC. The crate held up. Chalk that one up to spanners. Let's see.
His eyes flicked over at the readouts.
I've arrived, but I know not where. Starscape's completely unfamiliar. 0 point of reference. That puts me gabillions of light-years from home. No Class M planets in the vicinity. Don't understand that one.
There must be some kind of life around. Hang on, I'm getting something. A ship. Ace's features registered mild surprise, which, in the commander's emotional lexicon, was the closest he ever got to panic. Oh my godfathers, it's... And as the tachyon trail lost its integrity, the transmission spluttered and died. Part 3. Back to Backworld. The cat watched the festering heap of dung as slimy black flies waddled on top of it, took their sticky wings to their sides and started crawling into their maggot skins. The white skins sealed themselves, and the fat maggots began wriggling deep into the putrid mound. The cat said to himself. Lunch is almost ready. The cat, who had experienced some extremely weird days in his lifetime, ranked the previous day as his all-time #1 weirdest day ever. It had finally ended in the early afternoon. There had been hours of raised voices, recriminations, and much poring over star charts before the cat had finally given up hoping to get off this planet any time soon and had slipped up the spiral staircase for a quick nap. He'd crashed out for 20 straight hours, which surprised him, since he hadn't been feeling all that sleepy when he'd gone to bed, despite the day's exertions. Even more surprisingly, when he'd woke up, he was feeling tired, but as the afternoon wore on towards lunch, the tiredness had begun to dissipate. He supposed that was one of the many obnoxious things he was going to have to get used to here, going to bed when he felt most alert and getting up when he was at his tiredest. Well, he could live with that. He could live with most of the vagaries of the reverse universe. He could live with the fact that washing actually made him dirty, that combing his hair rendered it unkempt, and brushing his teeth left his mouth tasting foul. It stretched his patience to breaking point, but he could even live with the concept of putting on clothes that were creased and unclean, since they smartened themselves up over the course of the day. What he couldn't live with was the food business. He simply couldn't face the prospect of sucking excreta up through his butthole 3 times a day and regurgitating it neat and processed through his mouth onto a dirty plate. He couldn't even think about taking a leak. So he'd wandered out of Starbug while Lister and Rimmer were still sleeping and headed here to a high point on the mountain, on the blind side of the hillbilly still, to try and wrap his head around some way of throwing himself over the side without falling upwards. And while he'd been sitting and thinking, he suddenly developed an urge to dig a small hole by a bush, and he'd uncovered the dung. Depressing, isn't it? He swung towards the sound of the voice to see Lister picking his way down the narrow path towards him. You should worry. I've had to put up with it for 3.5 decades. The cat turned away and looked down into the green valley below. You're absolutely sure there's no way we can kill ourselves? Lister clambered down and perched on the rock beside him. It's not that bad. You get used to it. At least we're on a planet. At least there are people here. The cat's furrowed features slowly morphed into a grin. That is true, buddy. There are people here, and some of them are female people. Now you are playing my radio station. Look out, planet Earth. Sex god alert. Lister held out his hand, palm up. Before you get all fired up, I'd like you to think for a second about what, say, a blowjob entails in this place. The cat's grin widened for a second. Then ripples spread over his brow. Then the corners of his mouth straightened. Then they drooped like an unwaxed Viva Zapata moustache. Then his nose creased up and headed towards his hairline. Oh, man, he whined. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Lister grinned. You asked. Suddenly he felt a movement in his gullet, and something churned up his throat and into his mouth. He chewed, some kind of meat. He spotted a bone by the foot of the rock. He held out his hand and the bone leapt up into it. He brought up a chunk of pinkish meat and plastered it onto the bone. The cat's features were still curled up in disgust from the sexual nightmare he just subjected himself to. If he wasn't careful, he was going to spend the next 12 years squinting like Mr. Magoo. What the hell is that? Not sure. Lister regurgitated another mouthful and chewed thoughtfully. I think it's rabbit. He chewed some more. It's good, actually. Lister proffered the bone. Like to spew some up? Not just yet, bud, the cat smiled humorously. Ask me again in a couple of centuries. Lister shrugged, withdrew the bone, and hawked another chunk of meat onto it. Suit yourself. Listen, Me and Crichton are thinking of getting our heads together back at the Bug before Rimmer wakes up. Trying to sort out some kind of plan without the Queen of Panic flapping around. Plan? I know the plan. The cat spotted a small rock tumbling up the mountain's face towards him. He reached out and caught it. We sit here for the next 10 years, sucking duty up through our buttocks. It's not quite that simple. Coming. Just give me a second. I have to. I think I need. He nodded over at the pile. No sweat. Lister crouched on the rock and leapt a good 10 feet up onto the track. See you in 10. The cat watched him hike off back towards the cave, then looked back at the hole and wondered if it might be possible at least to starve himself to death. Lister had brought up an entire shank of the rabbit by the time he reached Starbug. There was a plate on the scanner table with more bones on it, so he dumped the joint he'd just regurgitated onto the plate and picked up another bone as Crichton stepped in from the small kitchenette that led to the midsection opposite the cockpit. Ah, you found lunch, sir. Lister waved the bone. Where'd it come from? The waste disposal unit regurgitated some bones. Close analysis indicated they probably belonged to a creature of the Oryctolagus cuniculus genus, a burrowing, gregarious, plant-eating mammal with long ears and a short tail, varying in colour from brown. It's a rabbit, right? That's what I just said, sir. I found a suitably dirty plate and arranged the bones on it. Oh, he peered at the plate. You've already disgorged a portion. Yeah, you better get the barbecue ready. We're going to have to uncook it soon. After which, presumably, I take the bloody raw dead carcass and try to insert it whole into its skin. Lister nodded. That's my guess, yeah. I reckon you'll find some sort of trap to stick it in. Leave it out overnight, and bingo, come morning he'll be frolicking around and gregariating with all his bunny friends. Crichton brightened. Wonderful. I like a meal with a happy ending. So, I guess that sorts out where all our food's going to come from. Where? Rimmer climbed down the spiral stairway, yawning and stretching. Lister tried to hide his disappointment. Trapping, hunting and fishing. We're living wild for the next 10 years. The cat staggered bandily in from the airlock. He looked harrowed and gaunt, as if he'd just spent a year in solitary on Devil's Island and topped it off with a 6-month stopover in the cool room at Alcatraz. I can't take it. Please, somebody shoot me in the head. Look, Lister handed the cat a bone. There's no point in bleating about it. We're stuck here. You're going to have to start looking on the bright side or go crazy. Bright side? The cat turned the rabbit bone over in his hand. There is a bright side then? There's plenty of positive stuff about this planet. Nobody dies here. Diseases actually make you feel better. Sure, sex isn't quite as much fun this way round, and the toilet arrangements are a drag. But at least we know we're going to be alive and healthy for the next 10 years, which is more than you can say for most universes. Rimmer coiled his arms around himself. Who's to say we're going to make the next flight window? Rimmer, we are definitely going to make it. I, for one, do not intend to spend my twilight years sitting in a high chair glooping apricot and apple dessert over some babysitter. Babies? The cat gagged on some rabbit meat. Are you seriously telling me we could wind up staying here till we're babies? I can't do that. It's impossible to be cool and be a baby. We are not going to miss that flight window, I guarantee it. Just think it through. How do you think the engines got buried so deep in the ground? How did they get all rusted up? Rimmer shrugged. Lister glanced over at Crichton, who was beginning to suspect he'd made yet another boo-boo, planning their takeoff, then nodded towards the airlock. Come on, he said. Take a look. They trooped down the landing ramp towards the cave's entrance. Lister pointed towards the distant mountain range. You have to think backwards. Don't imagine we're taking off. Imagine we're landing, only we've come in too low. We just make it over that mountain ridge, but we're losing altitude quickly. Then we hit the tops of them giant redwoods. A couple of the landing jets get ripped off and blast themselves into the ground. We skim along on a wing and a prayer, crashing through the treetops. The final landing jet gets wrenched loose and buries itself just a couple of 100 yards down there. Now the only thing keeping us up are some low-angled retros. The treetops start tearing great chunks out of the undercarriage. That's when the fuel canister those hillbillies found tumbles out. We see this mountain looming up towards us with no chance of getting over it. Then, in the nick of time, we spot the cave. We head for the entrance, set the retros on full blast and cross our fingers. We scorch those skid marks along the cave walls, and we've got just enough to stop. Now tell me, That doesn't make sense." There was a long silence. Crichton shuffled uncomfortably. He was hoping no one would make the logical observation, but Rimmer disappointed him. "Hang on a mo. Just uno tiny momentarola here. Are you saying we didn't actually need the jets to take off?" Lister shrugged. "Like I said, makes sense to me." "It makes sense, all right. Horrible, alarming sense." Rimmer rounded on the squirming mechanoid. "Because it means we could have taken off all the time. All that hunting around for the landing jets was completely unnecessary. As soon as we blasted off, they'd have lurched up out of the ground and started reattaching themselves." Lister shook his head. "You still can't wrap your head around the way things work here. You don't get a choice about what you do because you've already done it. All you're doing is undoing what you've already done. See? Don't try and baffle me with all this reverse philosophical claptrap mumbo-jumbo. We didn't undo it because we didn't try." Rimmer leered threateningly at Crichton. "And we didn't try because Captain Rotmind here didn't think it through properly." Lister sighed. Rimmer and the blame thing. Hard work. "Fine. The point is, we've got to sort out the work plan. First off, we have to remove the landing jet we've just attached and sneak it back to the hermit's shack." The cat, who clearly hadn't followed a word of the argument, looked up from his half-uneaten rabbit portion and asked, "Why?" "Sooner or later, those mountain boys are going to take the engine out into the woods, bury it, and unfind it in exactly the place it gets wrenched free from Starbug. I'm guessing we've patched up the undercarriage to make the bug livable in for the next few years. Before we hit the flight window, we're going to have to start dismantling the plates until the belly's a complete wreck. Then we wait for the whole shebang to unrust." Lister headed back up the ramp to the storerooms to search out the welding equipment. It would be a trial in itself, spending the next decade watching the rust fade away. By that time, he and the cat would be around 15. Teenagers. If the corrosion hadn't vanished completely by the 10-year deadline, they'd have to wait for the next flight window. According to their best calculations, that particular opportunity would occur when Dave Lister was less than 2 years old. Holly was trying not to think. Quite frankly, it was thinking that had got him into this mess in the first place, and the chances were that more thinking was only going to make things worse. Holly had started life as the onboard computer of the mining ship Red Dwarf. He'd been blessed with a fairly respectable IQ of 6,000, which had been more than enough for him to get the job done, with sufficient brainpower left over to defeat a couple of chess grandmasters, while simultaneously composing a fugue or two and making wholesale corrections to some laughably naive misconceptions in Stephen Hawking's and Albert Einstein's entire textual output. Then, a nuclear accident had killed off all but one of the crew, and Holly had been forced to spend the best part of 3 million years alone. The interminable loneliness had driven him, not to mince words, slightly balmy. 1 circuit short of a Grand Prix track. Computer senile. And so he might have remained were it not for a seemingly innocent suggestion by a cheap plastic talking toaster. Holly reflected sadly that actually being prepared to solicit advice from a budget-priced kitchen appliance was a mark of how low his intellect had dipped. The toaster had suggested that Holly might accelerate his intellect at the cost of slightly reducing the life expectancy of his runtime. And it had worked. Holly achieved a staggering IQ in the high 12,000s, only instead of measuring his life expectancy in terms of millennia, he measured it in milliseconds. Still, in his brilliant state, the paltry seconds allotted to him had been enough for him to formulate a rescue plan. He programmed the ship's Navicom to head for the backwards universe. Because of the reverse physics there, operating at his maximum intellect actually increased his lifespan. If only he could have stayed there a few decades, everything would have been just peachy. He would be one super-smart cookie of a computer right now. Unfortunately, he had to return to his own universe where he'd left Rimmer and the cat stranded in Starbug. He couldn't remember now quite why he hadn't brought them with him. Perhaps the trip had been too dangerous for them. Perhaps the stasis booths wouldn't operate if time were running backwards. Whatever the rationale, his genius self had left them there, and he must have had a damned fine reason. Still, he'd managed to prolong his life expectancy by several months, even running at super-intellect level. In order to extend it further, Holly then had to trade off some of his intelligence. He'd reduced his IQ to 3,000, but that only left him a few decades, which didn't seem very long at all. So he'd reduced it again, and again. And the stupider he got, the more it seemed like a good idea to swap more brain cells for more runtime. And now he'd reached the point where he was no longer smart enough to work out either his IQ or his life expectancy. He thought of reversing the process a little, but he found he couldn't recall the procedure. Holly could no longer remember if he'd enjoyed being super smart, but he certainly wasn't enjoying being one bulge shy of an underpants advert. It must have been nice, he thought, to know things, not to feel baffled by the simplest of life's mysteries, not to spend countless hours worrying, as he had recently done, about who it was that decided how many layers of peel there should be on an onion. Why, some onions had just one, while others enjoyed 6 or 7, even if they came from the same batch. It seemed cruelly whimsical of nature to deprive an innocent onion of sufficient protective mantle, yet to wrap otherwise identical onions in layer after layer of warm brown skin. Holly had got himself so steamed up about onion deprivation, he'd failed to notice the crew had neglected to return on schedule. When he did notice, they were almost a decade late. He wondered if perhaps he should try to go and find them, but what if he missed them? What if he risked the perilous journey to the backwards universe and they came out another way? Then he'd have to risk the journey back. And what if he did that, and they'd arrived to find him missing and gone back in to look for him? They could go on missing each other for centuries. Holly chewed over the problem for a couple of years, worrying himself into a panicky funk, until he finally decided it wasn't worth the mental anguish any longer and returned his attention to the semi-naked onion conundrum. He'd so resigned himself to spending the rest of his days utterly alone, he'd given up checking his radar scanners and didn't notice the approaching ship until it had actually landed in the docking bay. And with that one small error of omission, Holly's seemingly insoluble problems suddenly got considerably worse. It was a little before nightrise. Crichton was standing under Starbug's belly, leaning back so his chest light played over the gaping wounds in the craft's undercarriage. Given that the mechanoid always managed to find something to worry about, he was fairly happy with the way things were looking. The list of things he didn't want to think about currently consisted of only 2 items, which was just about an all-time record for him. And there were plenty of positive data to ponder. The last decade had seen the rust on the craft vanish completely. Weeks ago they had detached all the welded panels, and on Lister's impulse they had carried them to one of the mountain men's shacks and stacked them in a corner. And finally the flight window was open, and Crichton was determined to make it. All the signs were good. The twisted edges of the rents in Starbug's undersides had grown sharper and shinier. An hour ago a few had started sucking up smoke. Crichton twisted towards the cave walls. The ruts were starting to smoulder. He checked his internal chronometer and clucked with satisfaction. Time to round up the boys. He couldn't actually say at what point he'd started thinking of Lister and the cat as the boys. It had happened so gradually he'd barely noticed it. A combination of small things, really. Gradually, the 15-year-old Lister had become incredibly moody, and the most innocent query from Crichton could send him into sulk mode for hours on end. He also seemed to need to be left alone more often. He had developed an insatiable appetite for computer games. He would spend hours in the rest quarters feebly plucking at his guitar and singing mournful songs off-key. The most disturbing change from Crichton's point of view right now was that they'd started to play. They could be out in the forest till all hours of the night, climbing trees and staging mock battles with each other. Sometimes they could go missing for days on end. Crichton had warned them the previous morning of the proximity of the flight window, but they'd both developed a bizarre disrespect for any kind of authority, and there was no guarantee they'd bother to turn up at all. The early autumn sun ducked its orange head over the mountains beyond. Crichton waddled up to the cave's entrance and stared out. Just a few weeks earlier, as the bronze leaves had begun to leap onto the trees, a charred trail had started to show itself across the tips of the redwoods. Now it was getting more blatant. Crichton heard Rimmer yawn down the ramp and come towards him.
How's it looking?
Most propitious. Crichton waved his hands. In the glimmer of the twilight, some of the broken treetops were giving off smoke. Rimmer glanced at his watch. 9:30. Have they been out all night? Crichton nodded. Did you tell them we're looking to leave before 8? Crichton nodded. I don't suppose they paid much attention? Crichton shook his head. Rimmer muttered, "Gits," and strolled underneath Starbug. What bothers me is that pair of irresponsible gimboids are going to have to pilot this damn thing. It's going to be a hell of a ride, crashing backwards through those trees while those two masturbate furiously up front. Crichton turned. Oh, I don't think they masturbate excessively, sir. Not for young men of their age. Are you kidding? It's like the bloody monkey house up in those rest quarters. There's more fiddling goes on up there than in the court at Old King Cole. I swear to God they don't even stop during meal breaks. He peered up at the ripped metal around the engine's housing. There's one thing bothering me about this takeoff. It looks like Lister's prediction was right. We come in low over those mountains and skim across the treetops. What I'm wondering is, why? Why, sir? This was one of the two things that Crichton didn't want to think about. Yes, why do we come in so low over the mountains? Why can't we maintain altitude over the woods? It's been bugging me for a while. And this damage, he pointed at Starbug's underside. I can believe most of it's caused by the treetops, but that big hole in the back, that looks pretty nasty. This was the other thing Crichton hadn't wanted to think about. The rip Rimmer was indicating was indeed more savage than the rest of the damage. 3 meters across and almost circular, it had begun smoking before the rest of the craft. By now, it was getting almost red hot. Crichton had very few ideas about how that hole might be made, and none of them were palatable. He was saved from expounding them by Lister's breathless arrival in the cave. Rimmer stiffened visibly. His relationship with the increasingly immature Lister had soured to the point where they no longer conversed, merely exchanged insults. "Ah, Listy," he beamed and clasped his hands. "So glad you could tear yourself away from your imaginary friends and join us." Leering insolently, Lister raised the middle finger of his right hand and jabbed it in the air. Rimmer's beam broadened. "Marvellous! What a riposte! Such a shame we can't hang around until Oscar Wilde comes to life and the two of you could match wits." "Sir," Crichton interposed himself between them, "have you seen the cat around? We really should be thinking of preparing for takeoff." Lister shrugged and unslung the homemade bow from his shoulder. "He'll turn up. I mean, what's the big deal? Why is it always me who's supposed to know where he is? You're always getting at me. I'm not responsible for the cat. Just leave me alone, okay?" Crichton clucked nervously and waddled to the cave's entrance. The treetops were smouldering profusely now. As Crichton scanned the vista, a face popped upside down into the top of his vision. The cat grinned. "Hey, bud, what's happening?" He flipped from the lip of the entrance, landing straight in front of Crichton, and strutted towards Lister. Crichton watched Rimmer disappear up the ramp, then turned to the boys. "Now, sirs, it really is time. We all should be—" "All right!" Lister whirled on him, suddenly aggressive. "All right, we're coming. Christ! Is it illegal to have fun around here? Is it against the law or something?" He fixed Crichton with a look of petulant challenge, then he whirled again and stomped up the ramp, pursued at a confident ambling pace by the swaggering cat. Crichton stepped up to follow them, then ducked to catch a last glimpse of the red-hot wound in Starbug's belly. As he watched, a thin drool of molten metal leapt up from the cave floor and glooped itself onto the rim of the hole. There was no doubt in his mind now, none at all, that such a hole could have only been caused by one thing. A seriously high-powered, heat-seeking missile.